Hello, beloveds, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, a podcast for those who are survivors of childhood trauma, emotional neglect, and narcissistic abuse. This podcast is hosted by Rachel Leroy, a college professor and trauma survivor. Many of us spend years trying to heal and don't get anywhere. We don't always target the trauma itself, which is so often what keeps us stuck. This podcast is where faith meets science. Rachel is an emotional healing expert with 20 years of experience applying healing modalities that helped her start making progress after nothing else worked. She'll show you how to do the same. Each week, we'll cover a topic that will show you how to heal trauma for good. Please check out our website and show notes at ChristianEmotionalRecovery.com and join the Facebook community, Trauma Survivors Unite, Christian Emotional Recovery.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery. I'm your host, Rachel Leroy, and this is Season 3, Episode 16. We're moving right along, and this is the first podcast episode I've recorded in a couple of months because I try to record them a little ahead of time and then put them out in a couple of weeks. That doesn't always work out, but so it's kind of nice to have taken a break, and I'll probably be doing just a few more podcasts for this season and then taking another break at the end of the year and planning and getting started for the next season, Season 4. So 4th year of doing this coming up soon. That's so exciting. But this episode, episode 16, is what's the connection between love languages and healing trauma? What's the connection between love languages and healing trauma? And we'll talk about that in just a minute, just a few things. If you would like to help out with the podcast, please keep in mind that I work part-time. I have been looking for another job, and I'm still looking. And so the podcast is something I do for free, and I do it as a labor of love, and I love doing it. It's a privilege to do it, to help people like you, trauma survivors, and people who have experienced abuse and neglect. And so I love doing this. But to continue to make it possible, if you could give, that would be greatly appreciated. I'll be honest, my student loans kicked back in this month, so it's a little tight, but I keep doing it because I feel like this is what God wants me to do, and this is my ministry. I don't call it a ministry a lot of the time, but that's kind of what it is. And so podcasting is so much fun, but it's not a lucrative business at first. So what I am hoping to do, though, eventually is to monetize the podcast by creating some courses and some products and some services, and maybe even doing some coaching and or some workshops that you can pay a certain amount. And I understand that not everybody has a lot of money. I've been there myself. But if you can help, it's greatly appreciated. And there's 2 ways you can donate. One is Ko-Fi, which is kind of like buy me a cup of coffee kind of thing. But you can donate any amount that you see fit, whether it's $5 or $50 or whatever. And it's greatly appreciated. Ko-Fi, I've had some donators on there, and you are greatly appreciated. Thank you so much, Kimberly. And there's also Patreon, where you can be a monthly subscriber and you can donate where it comes out monthly. It's kind of like a membership, but you're helping me also if you can donate in that way. And Patreon is where creators that have patrons that help them, that's where you can donate and help creators of different kinds. And I create a podcast, and so that helps me to be able to continue to do this work, fund this work, because housing the podcast, housing the episodes, having a place to put it out at, creating the visuals, all the technical stuff that comes behind it, that does take funding. And so that helps me to be able to pay for those expenses as well as just live. So I greatly appreciate it. And you can do $5, $10, and $25 a month on that. But I may also start creating and opening up some other options for that as well. Okay. Also keep in mind, check out Christian Emotional Recovery, the podcast page, and I also have a regular page called rachelleroy.com, and that is where I keep my writing courses if you're interested in those, and also where I keep my regular website for Christian emotional recovery. You'll see 2 portals and you can go into the one that interests you, okay? Also check out the YouTube channel. I have not been making videos in that for the past couple of months. I'm hoping I can start back up as I'm able to with my health and my time and searching for a job. So please pray for me that something will come along and work out where I can do this without it being such a strain, and it'll make it a little easier and I'll be able to put more time into the podcast and actually maybe expand. I was thinking about doing like a blog or something like that. Having a background in writing, that would be perfect. So just if you can help, I greatly appreciate it. But check out the YouTube channel, check out the Facebook group, also with the same name. Just type in Christian Emotional Recovery and it'll come up. And let's go ahead and get started though. This is season 3, episode 16. What's the connection between love languages and healing trauma? Now, most of the episodes we do, I like it to either be something inspirational or motivational, or even more importantly, talk about concrete practices to go along with whatever the topic is. And keep in mind that this podcast is for trauma survivors, survivors of any kind of abuse, narcissistic abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, any kind of abuse, survivors of childhood emotional neglect. And like I've said in the past, this isn't about bashing anybody who may have fallen short. In some cases, people have evil people that harmed them and knew what they were doing. But in a lot of cases, this is people who were doing the best they could. That's not to condone what they were doing, but they didn't mean to cause harm. So I understand that there's 2 different kinds of survivors here, and I tend to fall into both of them. I won't go into detail about who is whom there, but I had one person who abused me who did it because it was pleasurable and they liked to torment me. And in other cases, it was people that loved me that fell short, if that makes sense. Okay, so, this is a complicated issue, and surviving any kind of trauma, having a high ACEs score, adverse childhood experiences score, is complicated for most people. And there can also be things working in tandem together. But why would I talk about love languages? What is the connection between love languages and trauma and surviving abuse and that kind of experience? Well, first of all, if you live in the Christian community, or even if you just like to read maybe self-help or self-development type books, you've probably heard of Gary Chapman's book, Love Languages. He's a Christian author, and he wrote this book, I think, back in 1992, and it became a bestseller, and it's really resonated in the Christian community and throughout, not just in the Christian community. And people have repurposed this in a million different ways, and because it resonates and there's some truth to it. I do want to put out a precaution or a disclaimer that love languages is not necessarily based on extensive research, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that shows that love languages, there's something to it. It's also not an absolute. Could there be love languages that are not identified here? Yes. And could there also be, it's complicated. So I'm not trying to make this an absolute, but I always like to put out those disclaimers because I'm a scholar. And I like to come at these issues from a scholarly point of view, even though I like to disseminate or communicate them in a way that is practical, usable, and interesting to somebody who is a survivor, to be able to help them, to empower them, to help them to heal their trauma, and to help them to consider a different angle on the healing journey where maybe healing has not happened before, where you can actually get some progress and make things happen. So that's what this podcast is all about, just a reminder. So how is love language connected to trauma survivors and to the effects of trauma in the body and in the mind? Well, a couple of things. Trauma will impact the kind of love language you have in a lot of cases. And also, trauma can also impact how you respond to relationships, right? Deeply. We all know this from experience. So this is going to sound kind of strange, but our love language in some cases can even be determined by what we didn't get as a child. Or in some cases, maybe even what we did that really resonated with us. Even though there are other factors that will determine our love language, such as genetics, there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that what we didn't get as a child, for example, if our parents let us scream in our crib and didn't hold us when we cried when we were babies, physical touch might be our love language. Or if we didn't get a lot of words of affirmation, great job, Gail. Great job, Johnny. This is a great little paper that you wrote. I love this work of art. How do you feel about that? What do you think about this? That is so smart. The kind of things that children need to validate their choices and their expression and their individuality that helps to build confidence, right? If there's a big void there, that could be just omission, negligence, so to speak, emotional neglect. And in that case, a lot of times parents didn't mean any harm, but they might have been busy or stressed, but it left a mark. And so maybe your love language is this word of affirmations. Maybe your parents never spent time with you, or maybe your friends never had time for you, or your spouse, your first husband or your first wife, maybe you're remarried, never spent any time with you. So your love language is time. You get the idea. So you see that can also be where we're most vulnerable in a relationship and where we can find safety the most too. So it's like a double-edged sword. It's where we find safety the most, but it's also where we're most vulnerable. And so that's what we'll be discussing today. We'll be discussing what are the 5 love languages, what determines your love language, how your love language is rooted, can be your most rooted and deepest insecurity, as well as your deepest source of safety. So that double-edged sword. And we'll talk about a trauma-informed approach to love language. What does safety have to do with it? Which I will say is everything. Safety is everything if you're a trauma survivor. And we're not just talking about physical safety where you don't want to get run over by a car or chased by a lion or, you want to be physically safe. We're talking about emotional safety. And then lastly, how can you be responsive to others and how can you get what you need through love languages? So keep in mind that we're doing this through a lens of trauma survival, okay, when we go through all of this. So what are the 5 love languages? Just in case you might not have heard about this in a while, or if you don't know what the love languages are, I just want to do a crash course in it. What is a love language exactly? What are the different types of love languages? And so let's look at that. I have, as always, articles. There's a Healthline article here called There Are 5 Love Languages. Here's how to find yours. And if you go online, there are hundreds of quizzes where you can take a love language quiz. And also keep in mind that you may have more than one primary love language. Okay, so keep that in mind, that there might be 2 or even 3 that stick out to you more. For example, mine are words of affirmation, quality time, and physical touch. Those are the ones that really stand out to me. The other 2, they matter, but they don't matter to me as much as those. As much as a hug, or somebody that takes time out of their day to spend it with me, or somebody who gives me a genuine compliment, for example. So the 5 love languages, this article is by Adrian Santos Longhurst, and it was medically reviewed by Lori Lawrence. And so it says, what is a love language exactly? And it says, do you have a friend who says they'd like a clean kitchen over flowers any day when you'd prefer a little romance? That right there is a basic example of different love languages. We all express and receive love differently, and those differences could be the reason why feelings and good intentions sometimes get lost in translation. For example, you spend weeks trying to find a partner the most amazing gift ever, but come their birthday, they respond with, I would have been happy just ordering in and then snuggling on the couch together. It's not necessarily that they're ungrateful, it says, or that you messed up. They just communicate their love differently or have a different love language. Recognizing how you and your partner like to receive and express love could lead to more thoughtful connection and a healthy relationship, not to mention less explosive birthdays and Valentines. People get so emotional on those days, also like Christmas and times like that. But keep in mind that this is not just with your spouse or your partner. It's also with anybody that you're close to, and really anybody that you interact with on a regular basis. So keep in mind that love languages are not just romantic relationships. They can be any relationship, your relationship with your friends, your family, a neighbor, a coworker, and so on. So keep that in mind too. You might even have a pet that has a love language. That is possible. I definitely see differences in pets and what they need. Okay, so what are the different types of love languages? Here it says there are 5 love languages, as first introduced in 92 by marriage counselor Gary Chapman in his book, The 5 Love Languages. The 5 love languages are words of affirmation, quality time, physical touch, acts of service, and receiving gifts. Okay, so love languages don't just apply to romantic relationships, it says. They can be helpful in your platonic relationships too. And then here there's a comparison chart. And basically what the chart shows is each love language, what it's associated with, how it might be yours, and if it sounds like a partner, if this sounds like a partner. So I'm not going to go through this whole chart, but I encourage you to read this chart because it'll give you a lot more breakdown of love languages. And then, of course, one thing you can always do is read Gary Chapman's book, which helps you learn in detail about the love languages. Now, I will mention I don't necessarily agree with everything Dr. Chapman believes, and I don't necessarily agree with every single thing in the book. But I don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater if I disagree with a few things. I try to get out of it what is helpful, and then I just don't worry about the rest, So use your discernment there, pray about it, as always. But it's a good book, and it's insightful, and it's helpful, and there's been a lot of follow-up books written about the love languages too. But words of affirmation, it says, are verbal expressions of love, appreciation, and encouragement. And you might say something like, I love you, for example. Words of affirmation might also be a genuine compliment. For example, thank you for making this meal. It means so much. This is so good. Or thank you for taking out the trash. I really appreciate that. Or you look really nice today. Or that was a really good song that you just played there. So, it can be in different ways. The next one, quality time, giving another person your undivided attention. A quality time is giving another person your undivided attention, and that might be making time for others. You feel disconnected when you don't spend enough time together. So that might be if your child needs that one-on-one attention, and that's really hard because you're busy. Carving 10 minutes out of the day just to talk to them about how they're feeling, how their day was, how things went for them, what they learned, can make such a difference. 10 minutes. And it might be taking 2 hours to go somewhere with the family once a week to make that undivided attention. It might even be for yourself. It might be, I'm going to take 2 hours on Sunday afternoon to take a walk, meditate, and take a bubble bath and pray in the tub. And that's your quality time with yourself, right? And with God. Keep in mind that love languages also are connected to God. How can we give these things to God in our sacrifice, in our time with God, in how we serve God? How can we allow God to give those things to us? But we have to connect with God to be able to do that, right? So physical touch is the next one. That's connection through appropriate physical touch, non-sexual or sexual, depending on the context. In most cases, non-sexual. Most of it is, so keep that in mind. It might be hugs or holding someone's hand or patting them on the back. Also, I make a note here, please, of course most people know this, but this is only consensual touch. And obviously that should be obvious to most people. So if you're, quote, a touchy-feely person, you feel most love when embraced or touched. You might hold hands with your spouse or even a close friend, or it might be cuddling with your husband or your wife. It might even be with your dog or your cat. You like them to sleep next to you at night because it makes you feel safe. So that's physical touch. And then acts of service is the next one. Selfless, thoughtful acts that make a person's life easier. So acts of service might be you're happy when someone helps without being asked. Actions speak louder than words for you. So you'll also find that generally, not always, but generally, people tend to give more naturally through their own love language. For example, acts of service, I'll be honest, I struggle with that one. I've had to work on that a little more. I tend to be better at words of affirmation and quality time and stuff like that with people. But acts of service might be a husband taking a trash out for his wife, or it might be going by and visiting your elderly mother who you haven't seen all week, even though you're busy, and spending a couple of hours dusting her furniture and having dinner with her. It could be anything like that. It could be something you do in the church. It could be something you do in the community. It could be something someone does for you. And if that's your love language, then if somebody does something for you, it could be practical, or it could be more romantic or more impractical. It could just be something that is so sweet that somebody does for you. But you get the idea. And then lastly is receiving gifts. This one is obvious. Tangible tokens of love and thoughtfulness. That doesn't mean you go out and buy somebody a diamond ring or a new car, even though there's not necessarily anything wrong with that as long as you're not bribing someone. But it might be you pride yourself in giving thoughtful gifts. You appreciate meaningful gifts. For me, that's not one that means that much to me. It just doesn't. It does mean something, but it doesn't mean as much as some of the others. And gifts is not my strong suit when it comes to giving. I tend to, on a holiday, just make sure that I spend time with someone and give them my attention for a few hours, more than buying gifts. I do bring gifts, but I don't necessarily do elaborate gifts, if that makes sense. So you have to see what your gifts are and where they stand out to you. And where you give is often what you need as well, though not always. And so just going through all of these, I think you've got a good idea of what the love languages are. Now, going to the next part, what determines your love language? That's a very good question. And we'll go to another article in just a second that talks about what does determine it. I think it's complicated. I think it's kind of like the chicken or the egg, nature versus nurture. Mental health conditions, for example, depression. Are you born with it? Is it something that you have a propensity towards where it might kick in if you have a certain environment? Is it caused primarily by adverse childhood conditioning? There's a lot of factors there, and it's complex, and we can't get an absolute. But one thing we do know is that love languages can be determined and or steered more likely in a certain direction by your own background, by how you interacted with the adults around you as a child, and even other children. So keep in mind, love languages aren't just what happens between us and our significant other, but it also includes our relationships like friends, family, children, parents, siblings, colleagues, ministers, coaches, all kinds of people that we interact with both as children and as adults. And there is a website called Tara Relationship Coach. She's a relationship coach, Tara Relationship Coach. And in her article, she talks about what determines your love language. Now, keep in mind, this is not based on research per se, but it's anecdotal evidence, and it does make a lot of sense. Tara Relationship Coach is the website. Brian Ball is the one that wrote the article, and he writes about his experience of his dad. He played soccer, and his dad would compliment what he did well, but he would keep a running record of things that he fell short on, no matter how small they were. And he says he was well-meaning, but that kind of stuck with him, and it kind of impacted him. And so words of affirmation, something he didn't get enough of, the other was emphasized more, was his love language. And that's how he began to realize there was a connection between whatever you did not get, or maybe if you did experience either abuse, or I wouldn't call that abuse, what he went through, but I would say that it impacted him. So whatever impacts you, it doesn't even have to be abuse, is what will determine your love language. So he says whatever your love language is likely what you did not get as a child. So if your love language is gifts, he said, you likely didn't receive many gifts, or the ones you got weren't what you wanted, or weren't thoughtful or meaningful in some other way. Again, this is not to be ungrateful or anything. I'm just trying to show you how this can impact your makeup, your identity, and what orientation you have in terms of love languages. It says if your love language is physical touch, your parents or siblings didn't often hug, cuddle, or otherwise be physically affectionate with you. You may have also received touch you didn't like, for example, if you and your siblings always wrestled with or hurt one another. So, in my case, my parents actually told me they loved me. They actually did hug me. But physical touch is still one of mine. And I discovered that my parents at the time, this is so messed up, and the research has shown now that this is very damaging to childhood development, but parents didn't know this at the time, that the Ferber method, a lot of people would let a young baby lay in a crib and cry, and they thought they could self-soothe. Okay, a baby under the age of 1 cannot self-soothe. They're not capable of it. But they didn't have that research at the time, and it can actually, I think in a lot of cases, cause people to be starved for touch because that part of your brain did not develop properly to have that connection, to have that soothing. Does that make sense? And that's part of, I think, one reason with physical touch. If you actually did get hugged as a child, that might be a reason why you still have that love language. If maybe you weren't touched and held, that's why that skin-to-skin contact is so important with newborns, right? We know that now. And then, so another one is quality time. You may have spent a large portion of your childhood alone, whether because you were an only child, had different interests than the rest of your family, or because you faded in the background due to having multiple siblings. Or another one I would argue is that your parents, if there is poverty or adverse financial situations, which can increase the chances of trauma, unfortunately, your parent may have been working 2 jobs to make ends meet and they were doing the right thing, but they just didn't have as much time to be with you, unfortunately. Again, not their fault, but it does impact you. If your love language is acts of service, you may have had to always do things for yourself or had to start doing things for yourself and others, common with latchkey kids or older siblings when parents work. I was a latchkey kid. Again, it was the necessity of the times. Both of my parents worked. We came home from school early, and especially in that time period where free-range kids kind of, it was a thing. And I think there's a balance there. Helicopter parenting is probably no better, and that's why that balance is so delicate, right? Kids need attention. They need affirmation, they need interaction, but they also need to be able to test the waters and test boundaries and make some of their own mistakes too, right? It's a balance of things. Acts of service. If that's your love language, you may have had to always do things for yourself, or like I said, that's part of that. If your love language is words of affirmation, you were often criticized or critiques for your failings and or didn't often hear verbal praise for your accomplishments. In my case, my parents didn't criticize me a lot, but I was around certain other people that would criticize me incessantly. And then I did not get a lot of words of affirmation. It was just not something, once in a while, I'm proud of you. But that's so important. I think that's one of the most important things when kids are coming along, just to say, good job, or how do you feel about that? Just talking and treating them like kids like they're human. It's only in the last 20 years or so that people actually realize that kids are just little adults that haven't grown up yet. In other words, they are valid human beings with feelings, and they're complex little beings, and their feelings matter. And we were taught that kids were to be seen and not heard, right? What damaging things that we taught kids growing up when we were young. And we're working through that stuff now, We're working through the reality of it. So a few things about what determines your love language and how your background affects that. Like I said, there's a connection between what we crave and need and what our deficit was in childhood, or deficits in some cases. And there are other factors that go into this as well, such as positive memories that might stand out when we receive the love language as well. So it might even be something that was good, that maybe for some reason left a good groove in our brain, so to speak. Or our natural traits that tend to push us more towards certain love languages. I do believe that some people are more geared towards one naturally than another based on their natural makeup. But the factors that go into determining your love language are complex, and what happened in our childhood, and especially unmet areas of need, will help determine our love language. But it is important to note that we can have more than one love language. I said that before. And what might be stronger over time might also change over time based on new experiences, having those needs met, or maybe having other needs not met to a greater degree. And love languages aren't an absolute, but they are a framework of understanding ourselves better. Okay? So the next thing that we were going to talk about was how your love language is your deepest insecurity. Now that's a double-edged sword because it's also your deepest point of safety. It's when you get that, you feel the safest, you feel the most connected. That fight or flight tends to come down, and your parasympathetic nervous system, your vagus nerve kicks in, and that's the part that calms you. That's the part that soothes you and slows all of that stuff down, right? So in Psychology Today, there's an article, and it talks about how your love language can be your deepest insecurity. So I want to help you to see the connection between that concept and what determines your love language. And so those tend to be our patterns. Those are our patterns overall, not just patterns with love languages, right? If where what we didn't get, what we needed, is often our primary love language, then it makes sense that that would also be our greatest vulnerability. If we're overlooked or mistreated in that area, it's going to affect us more than somebody else, and more than if we get overlooked or mistreated, so to speak, in another area. Does that make sense? So if gifts are really important to you, if your husband or your wife forgets to give you a gift for your birthday, it's going to hurt your feelings a lot more maybe than somebody else who would rather go out and have quality time with their spouse. So you see, people have preferences. That's why it's good to find out the people you're close to, what they need and what they want. And don't give them what they need and want based on what you think they need or want, or what you need or want. Give them what they need or want based on what they say they need or want. And it's sad how many people don't see the difference. And it is so important. And I fall short. But it's good to be aware of that, because that can help so much. But the Psychology Today article, this one is by Cody Commerce. He's a PhD student. And so he says there are two mainstays of Chapman's model. That's the love languages. The first is that there are different love languages, and we know what those are. The second is that each person has a primary love language. That means the means through which they most directly feel loved. One person might care a lot about hearing that they're doing a good job, words of affirmation, where another might care more about knowing someone carved out time with their busy day to spend time with them, quality time. While everyone is going to appreciate any positive act directed their way to some extent, love languages are a good way to put your finger on what's going to matter most. One misconception, it says, about love language is that they're about how a person expresses love. While you may certainly think about them in this way, Chapman goes on in pains in his book to stress that they're about a way a person feels loved. The point is not to figure out how you most conveniently and effortlessly express love, but how to make your partner, and I hate that they keep just talking about your partner, but this could be anybody in your life, how to make them feel the most valued. If such a mismatch between love languages that goes unidentified, if there's such a mismatch, it can be a major source of tension in a relationship. And then sometimes people don't even know why, right? And then it says, when what makes your partner feel most valued doesn't come naturally to you, simply having a label to put on that discrepancy can make an improvement because you're aware of it. And then it says, but there's another thing which has gone underappreciated about love languages. It's a sort of corollary to Chapman's model. And it says your primary love language is not only the most direct way to make you feel loved, it's also your biggest vulnerability. It's where you are most exposed for someone to hurt you. Take touch, for instance. Touch is relatively low on my personal ranking. This is the writer of love languages. That means that touch simply does not matter all that much to me. If someone I love expresses their feelings through touch, then I'm unlikely to be as sensitive to it as if they did so through quality time, my primary love language. But on the flip side, the flip side is that it's difficult to make me uncomfortable through touch. If someone I don't know gets overly touchy, it's not especially unpleasant for me. If it isn't something that I'm going to be circling back to throughout the day and marinating in uneasiness of the social interaction. That's not true for people I know who touch is their primary language. Unwanted touch makes them feel really disconcerted. So, and then they say they're much more sensitive about quality time, and basically if somebody just overlooks them and doesn't spend any time with them, that will affect them more. So you see how the lack of something can actually impact how somebody responds to something. Now, if you're a trauma survivor, you survived a lot of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. If you survived a lot of neglect, emotional neglect especially, or even physical neglect, if you suffered from narcissistic abuse, emotional abuse, any of that on a stronger, higher level, and it impacted you more, these are gonna impact you even more. So everybody, even if they're not a trauma survivor, will be impacted if somebody somehow neglects or harms unintentionally or intentionally in their love language category. But for people that are trauma survivors, it's amplified even more. So being aware of that, being sensitive to that in yourself, and if you have people that you love and you know their love language, whether they are a trauma survivor or not, being sensitive to that in them can be so helpful. It can be so helpful for making them feel safe and for adding solidarity and safety and connection to your relationship. Okay, so a little bit about the next part, a trauma-informed approach to love languages. What has safety got to do with it? Well, safety has everything to do with it. Safety is everything when you're a trauma survivor. Again, physical safety is important, but we're talking more here about emotional safety, because when you're a trauma survivor and you have a trigger, that trigger is not in the present moment. The trigger is from some point in the past, and something similar to it triggered it now. That's why being grounded in the present moment, remembering that you're a grown adult, and remembering that it's something that happened in the past helps you to come back to the here and now. And that's why safety is so important. So there's an article called Move Over Love Languages, and it's also in Helpline. It's in Helpline, and it's called Move Over Love Languages. Do you know your route to safety? And it says, according to this expert, these trauma-informed love languages can lead to deeper connections. So understanding your love language is also a route to safety if you're a trauma survivor. And grounding and rooting in safety is what almost all trauma survival healing exercises and practices is all about. Or it's about releasing things that make you feel unsafe. So it's either going towards safety or it's about letting go of things that make you feel unsafe in the body. Remember, trauma is rooted in your nervous system, so you need to go back to the source in your nervous system to help it to come out, to release it, to heal. So knowing your love language and knowing these routes to safety and knowing which ones are the strongest for you is actually going to help you to heal. Okay? So in this article, I'm going to read a couple of things here to help sort of solidify this, and then we'll talk about it in just a second. Okay, so it says, for those who have experienced trauma or other painful experiences in their life, safety with others is one of the keys to feeling more human, more connected, right? And this article, by the way, is by Gabrielle Smith, and this is Helpline. And she says, however, these experiences can often make it difficult to communicate with our loved ones, which can make it difficult to feel safe in the first place. Asking for what we need when we're codependent is difficult, but that's why we talk about speaking up, setting boundaries, being healthy. For somebody who's a codependent, especially if you've been raised in a Christian community, and even more so if you're a woman and you've been raised with traditional, very conservative Christian values, being meek and mild and quiet and not speaking up are probably things you've been taught. And those are things that under certain circumstances, maybe not always, you need to learn to overcome them, because you need to be able to speak up. You need to be able to advocate for yourself and other people. And that doesn't mean you can't be meek or humble or quiet or calm. It just means that there's a time and a place, and if that's not who you are, then that's not who you are, right? And so it says, so how can we reconnect and establish this sense of security? It says one way is through routes of safety model. It's a tool created by Jake Ernst. He's a therapist and he's a Toronto-based psychotherapist. It's a polyvagal-based model. Remember, if you don't know what polyvagal is, there are some YouTube videos and some podcast episodes I've done on polyvagal theory and the vagus nerve. So Google those and you can get some more context on what polyvagal is. But basically the polyvagal nerve is a nerve that runs through your whole body, and it runs a lot of the systems in your body, but it also is that part of your body that brings you out of fight or flight. It slows you down, it calms you down. It's your safety center in your nervous system, basically. Okay? But it says he uses a polyvagal based model, meaning it addresses the state of our nervous system as a key part of our mental health. And then he has this chart here. It's like a bubble with a bunch of lines coming out of it. It looks like a sun with the little rays. But the different types of routes of safety are common humanity, inner guidance, structure and certainty, sensory experiences, quality relationship, protective measures, closeness and proximity, and private retreat. So those are the 8 routes of safety in his model that he came up with. And keep in mind that a lot of these you can find in your relationship with God, and there are a lot of ways you can do all of these. But it says, in acknowledging safety as an essential part of intimacy, and in examining how our environment affects our sense of safety, Ernst believes we can deepen our connection with others. And then he created the routes of safety model to help others understand how we get to and access safety. So it says, what are the routes of safety and how can they aid relationships? There are 8 different ones. I just listed them. And they come from 3 overarching categories. I encourage you to read these charts because it'll help you see it visually. And then you can get a better idea of how they're organized and stuff. I'm not going to read all this, but I just want to give you an idea. 3 overarching categories or pathways that can help us understand the needs of ourselves and others. To understand your own routes of safety, begin by asking yourself. And then it has a chart and it lists all 8 of them and it says what pathway they are. And then it gives an example of them. I'm not going to read all that because that's a lot. But let me just read the routes again and the pathway of each one. Now, there are 3 pathways. Self-resourced, so the self, inner self, self-resourced. Socially sourced, so it's with other people, other things, other entities. And action-oriented. Action-oriented. Okay, so those are the 3 pathways that all 8 of these are categorized under one of those per route of safety. Okay, does that make sense? So, for example, inner guidance. That could be devotions, that could be praying, that could be meditating, that could be reflection or journaling, but that's self-resourced. And, this is not religiously based. So you can also say that this comes from God. We believe as Christians that our inner guidance is Christ, the Holy Spirit, and God, especially the Holy Spirit inside of us, right? Self-resourced, meaning it's accessed primarily within oneself. The next one is sensory experience. That is based on your physical experience. That's part of the healing journey of trauma. That's self-resourced. Private retreat, which is, if you're doing a lot of this, you're doing this on your own. But it isn't necessarily just doing practice. It might be curled up with a book in a quiet room on a Sunday afternoon when it's raining. That's a private retreat. That's also self-resourced. That can also be healing. The next one, the socially sourced ones, are quality relationships, closeness and proximity, and common humanity. So it depends on connecting with others in that case. Quality relationships are maybe the connection you have with your mom, or having a significant other, or you're just having pets like your cat, your dog, your bird, or it could be friends. It could be people at church if you go to church. It could be so many different places. Closeness and proximity is also socially sourced, and that one's a little bit different because relationships are our the close people in our lives, right? Closeness and proximity doesn't necessarily have to be a relationship, but it can be, because some people, like during COVID, I would go somewhere just to be around people, and it made me feel better. I never talked to anybody or interacted with anybody, but I was so isolated, just being around people was helpful. So closeness and proximity, being around that, can be regulating to your nervous system. And then the last one, common humanity. That could be being seen and heard, not being judged, maybe having a common cause or a common belief. I would say that there's a lot of that at churches, even though some churches fall short in that area too. But it's having common experiences with other people in general. Maybe it's a group of people that have a common belief or purpose, for example. If you go out and help homeless people, it might be connecting with that community and with the people you work with, for example. It doesn't have to be that expressed, though. It can be more subtle than that as well. Protective measures and structure and certainty are action-oriented routes of safety. Protective measures and structures and certainty. So protective measures might be setting a boundary. It comes from a tangible action or change, though. It might be defending someone or someone defending you. It might be setting a kindly and loving boundary to protect yourself or to protect somebody else even. If you see somebody being mistreated and you speak up, that is a protective measure. If someone says, can you come to this party Friday night, and you're so burnt out you can barely get out of bed and you're like, no, I'm sorry, I can't. That's a protective measure. It's not necessarily that somebody's trying to hurt you, but you have to do, you get what I'm saying. Structure and certainty is action-oriented, and that's like having a consistent routine, having agency, a sense of mastery in one's life, financial security, solutions to a problem, scheduling, planning, goals, predictability. And while it's good to remain flexible, structure and certainty are so helpful for trauma survivors, especially having a regular practice, for example. So I'm not going to keep going through these. I've been talking about this for a while. Thank you for bearing with me. But I just wanted you to see these paths to healing. And why did I share this with you? Well, it shows you that there's a good list of practices for healing. And these are very similar to the love languages. One may resonate more with you than another. And then at another time, you might need something else. And so staying in tune with yourself and what you need is important. And the people that you love, the same thing. Sometimes it's best just to ask them straight up, what can I do to help? What do you need here? Would it be more helpful? Maybe they had some kind of letdown or disappointment or something, some kind of loss. You could be like, what do you want right now? Do you want to just sit in front of the TV and me just cuddle? Or would it be, do you want to go get something to eat? Do you want to go out and have a fun but not sinful night on the town and forget about things? That's the kind of things that you can ask your partner or your friend or whoever to help them, right? Can I get you something? That kind of thing. But all love languages can be good for everyone to express, give, and receive. And all of those strategies can be good for everyone. But what works best for you will probably be certain ones more than others, and that might change over time. And what types of trauma you experience or experienced, whether you experienced childhood neglect, and then the types of ways you might have not had your needs met will determine which of these paths of safety work best for you. So go with what works for you, but don't be afraid to explore new ones. There's a combination of structure, predictability, experimentation, and flexibility in your practice. So you see how all this connects? Try to incorporate some from each category, self-sourced, social, and structure into your routine in some way. So I would say just try to have some balance. For example, doing self-sourced stuff and never interacting with other people is not healthy all the time. Even if you're an introvert like me, you need to get out and interact with healthy, safe other people. And if you tend to not have any kind of structure in your life, even a little bit of structure can be helpful. It doesn't have to be rigid. And it might be just some kind of grounding or some kind of certainty that you can give yourself, because trauma, there can be so much uncertainty in your emotions and things going on in your life. And if you have chronic conditions like me, you never know when they're going to flare up, and that causes anxiety. And so staying grounded, and for me, staying busy can be helpful, but it's also important to slow down and feel what's going on in your body and be in touch with yourself. So you find that balance. So try to incorporate a little bit of all three. It's important to note that time with God can be all three of these, depending on the ways you spend time with God in prayer, meditation, journaling, devotions, reading scripture, going to church, singing, praise and worship, acts of service. Those are all worship, right? though they can also be paths of safety. Now, we do serve God to serve God because we love God and we love humanity and we serve people. But doing these and their healing at the same time can also be therapeutic. There are people that get too caught up. There are people that serve until they burn themselves out. And that's why if you balance these, you know when to back off and say, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. And you have to take a break. Or when you've been the chair of this board in church for 6 years and it's time to step down. Or when you feel called by God to do something that you haven't done in a while, whatever the case may be. So a little bit more about how this comes together. There's an article in Brickell and Associates. They're a therapy, they do therapy. Brickell, their article though, it talks about why safety is essential. And I just wanted to read a couple of paragraphs about why safety is essential and how trauma can create barriers to that. And then that's all the more reason why safety is essential. So let me read that real quick, and that will kind of wrap up everything that I'm talking about here. Why safety is essential. So this is, like I said, by Brickell and Associates, and this is written by Robin Brickell, and she is a therapist in this practice. So she says, why is safety essential, especially for trauma survivors? Humans are wired for connection. We all long to be loved and cared for and know we are supported in life. We nurture connection in ways we express ourselves. The love languages sound like a good concept for nurturing a healthy relationship, except for one thing. Love languages can work only when assuming that both partners or people's brains are able to clearly, calmly, in online function, right? So this is often not the case for trauma survivors who frequently exist in a state of alarm. They are living with a traumatized nervous system and survival impulses have hijacked their brain. Our injuries do not occur in a vacuum, it says. And this is a quote by Ariel Schwartz that she's quoting. It says, our injuries do not occur in a vacuum, so our healing cannot occur in one either. Our hurts and losses need to be repaired interpersonally. We cannot heal alone. And that's by Ariel Schwartz. She's one of the leading experts on healing trauma. I've actually used a lot of her sources in the podcasts here. I love her work. But she says, this is back to Brickell. She says, trauma creates barriers to using love languages. Many trauma survivors feel wary about love languages. Trusting them or using them can feel too risky without a foundation of safety inside themselves and in the relationship. Any of the love languages, affirmation, physical touch, etc., can be memory triggers for many times they felt endangered and manipulated. They can signal threats to a trauma survivor if a basis of trust and safety has not been established and healing has not occurred. This is why compliments are hard for trauma survivors to accept. Without safety, even compliments can feel threatening. It might be like you feel good, but there's also some icky, uncomfortable feeling you have too. I've been there, I know. It says, trauma survivors often view relationships through a lens that evaluates the risk of danger, because of that fight or flight you're always in, as they do most things prior to healing. Even if the relationships are actually safe, the trauma survivor's nervous system is biased to see danger. It takes time and work for trauma survivors to learn to be present in these relationships and know they're safe. And she says, my colleague Heather Tuba does incredible work supporting partners of trauma survivors. And then she gives some resources there. So first, you have to establish safety in the moment. She says, for trauma survivors, experiencing safety in a relationship requires the ability to be in the present in order to actually derive comfort and joy from the relationship. And it goes into more detail about that. And she says, recognizing safety takes work. Emotional safety in a relationship looks like, and she lists a lot of different things that it might be, like being able to talk openly to each other and not feel overwhelmingly anxious, or knowing you will be heard. And she has a bunch of them here. Noticing if each other is uncomfortable or triggered, knowing your loved one's triggers and them knowing yours, and so on. Trauma survivors, is there safety in your current relationship? And there are questions she has you ask yourself yourself here. And then safe relationships make healing possible. And she quotes another expert, Harville Hendricks. I've also heard of their work. But they say, we are born in relationship, we are wounded in relationship, and we can be healed in relationship. And so it is, if safety is not present in your current relationship, she's got an article you can read. So basically, you need to feel safe in a relationship to be able to practice these things. And that's why the healing is so important, to have good relationships, and why good relationships are so important to healing, ones that are safe and loving. Okay, so that's just a little bit more about how all this comes together. So how can you be responsive to others, and how can you get what you need through the love languages? How can you be responsive to others, and how can you get what you need through the love languages? So the key for trauma survivors is safety. Safety in relationships, safety in expressing themselves, safety in giving, and safety in receiving through the love languages. And in loving one another, loving ourselves and loving other people who have been hurt in the past, and even in loving ourselves, we need to keep the love languages, what ours tend to be, what other people's tend to be, in mind. And that's why communication is so important as well. So keep in mind again that this isn't just romantic relationships. It could be any kind of friendship, family relationship, anything. Of course, you want to make sure that those are safe. If you're around somebody who's abusive and they cut you down all the time, or maybe they're even physically abusive or sexually abusive, get the hell away from those people. I'll say it again, forgive my French, but get the hell out. If your physical safety in the immediate now is in any way in question, you need to get out of that. If you're being sexually abused in any way, you need to get out of that. If it's a situation where it's a little tricky, I understand it's a little more complicated than that. I've been in a lot of those myself. And if you're in a safe relationship, this is especially important to be able to know these love languages, and to, you don't have to know everything about everybody, but just knowing one love language for somebody that you love, and knowing the kinds of things that mean something to them. Like maybe your sister, you have a safe, healthy relationship with your sister, and she loves gifts, and you know that she collects Fabergé eggs. So when you go on a travel, you go to a gift shop and you always get her a Fabergé egg. That will make her feel loved and appreciated. Or maybe she's the kind of person that wants you to spend time with her, and she lives one town over, so you meet and get coffee for an hour every 2 weeks. So you see what I'm saying? Base it on what means to her or to him, whatever their love language is. So how does all this come together? How does all this come together at the end? Why have we talked about love languages? Well, love languages, what do they look like for trauma survivors? They are paths of safety. They are actual concrete practices that help you to heal in the body and in the mind. We've talked about what the love languages are. We talked about why love languages are important for trauma survivors, especially how those can be more pronounced by what determines our love language based on adverse childhood, and in some cases, positive childhood experiences. We talked about how your love language is your deepest insecurity, but also your deepest contact of safety. So that's why knowing it and knowing how to practice it can be helpful when you're triggered, especially, but anytime. And how a trauma-informed approach to love languages is important, and what safety has to do with it. And so let me talk about the safety model, because I think safety is one of the most important concepts in trauma healing. So I may have a podcast episode at some point in the future, or a YouTube on safety, because I think that's that important. So, and then we talk about how you can be responsive to others and yourself, and how you can get what you need through love languages and through those paths of safety. So I encourage you to especially review the articles with those charts. I'll put the articles in the show notes. But thank you so much for going on this journey with me. And thank you so much for listening. I hope that this has been helpful for you. I hope that this has helped you to think about trauma surviving and love languages in a new way to harness and utilize love languages to help you heal. Get Gary Chapman's book and just read it if you haven't. It's a good book. Like I said, I don't necessarily agree with everything he writes or talks about, but I think there's a lot of good ideas in there. And it's been a privilege talking to you and listening to you. And this is episode 16 of season 3 of Christian Emotional Recovery. And this has been What's the Connection Between Love Languages and Healing Trauma? Thank you so much for listening. Remember, you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and God loves you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Christian Emotional Recovery, hosted by Rachel Leroy. For links to this week's resources and to join the discussion, check out this episode's show notes at christianemotionalrecovery.com, where you can also find links to our YouTube channel and Facebook group. Join our email list and get other episodes and resources. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review the podcast and tell a friend who may benefit from this message. See you next time. And remember, beloveds, God loves you, and you are fearfully and wonderfully made.